Welcome to Ninerology. I'm your host, Alan, and it is the last week before the 49ers' early offseason kicks off. It's been the first time they've missed the playoffs in 4 years. As you know, the 49ers have made several conference championships under Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch, their regime. And in the past 8 years, it's been feast or famine. The 49ers have either made the conference championship or a Super Bowl. They made two Super Bowls and lost both of them, or they've completely missed the playoffs. There hasn't been an in between for the Lynch and Shanahan regime. It's either been we're going to go deep into the playoffs or we're just going to miss it entirely. And this season is a continuation of that. They had four back-to-back years where they made it to the playoffs, multiple conference championships, and then two Super Bowl appearances. And then this year, it seems like a lot of that just caught up. There were several injuries, several mishaps, things that they just couldn't overcome. There were poor coaching decisions, game management. But I think throughout this entire week, you've heard a lot of quotes either from players or from the front office that the 49ers essentially need to take a look within. They need to figure things out what's really going on. In fact, George Kittle, captain on the team, mainstay, and basically he sets the culture. He's the culture setter for the team. Had this to say: we have a lot of stuff to figure out, a lot of little things, whether it's pre-snap stuff, getting our plays right, having a really efficient offense and scoring more touchdowns. I have incredibly high expectations for this team, for this organization, just like I think everybody in the building does. And then John Lynch was quoted earlier in the week talking about how the 49ers need to reset, get back to their winning ways. And there's a lot to look at. There's a lot of fingers to point, but I think a lot of it comes down to coaching and leadership. Everything rises and falls on leadership. And coaching is where it starts. You look at the 49ers, just the offense alone. Let's talk about Kyle Shanahan because he's been there. He's a common denominator. Last year entering the playoffs, the 49ers averaged 28.8 points per game, just under 29. And you can probably round that up to 29 because during the last game they rested a few starters. And this year, 1 year later, that dropped down to 22, an entire touchdown less per game that the 49ers averaged. And then at the beginning of the year, before roster cutdowns, the 49ers led the league in players over the age of 30. The 49ers had 18 players over the age of 30, which is far above the rest of the league. And when you break that down, specifically in the NFC, where the 49ers have their direct competition, especially this year, you have the Detroit Lions, who we know is going to be a force to be reckoned with for years to come. You have the Eagles. You have the Packers. You have several teams that are moving. You still have the Bucks that are continually in that conversation. You have Washington, that's now going to be with Jaden Daniels that are going to start kind of creeping into that conversation over the next few years. The 49ers need to figure out a way. How do you get younger, but still maintain that experience that you need? How do you continue to keep up with these teams that are hitting their stride at the right time? When you look at the average age, the 49ers average age is just under 29 years old. It's like 28 and 10 months. But when you look at the Packers, their average age is just at 25. The Lions is just at 25. The Eagles is at 26. And this is their average age, which means they're going to be young. They're going to be healthy for quite a while. And so the 49ers need to figure out how do we get younger, but also how do we retool? It's not a rebuilding type of year, but we do need to figure out what are the core problems that cause us to not only just miss the playoffs. Injuries happen. That's just part of the NFL. But how do we keep the guys that we rely on healthy? How do we develop other players, but also how do we make sure that if we lose a star player, that doesn't ruin the season? There's got to be things that you can do coaching wise. There has to be things development wise. Special teams, how do you address that? The 49ers ranked dead last this year in special teams. And that has been a notorious kryptonite, Achilles heel for Kyle Shanahan throughout his 8 years here. Special teams has just been atrocious. In fact, every Super Bowl that the 49ers have been, which is the past two, or conference championships that they've lost, there's been a special teams blunder. Most recently, this past year, Ray McLeod's muffed punt ended up resulting in the Chiefs recovering the ball, got them right back in the game, was a momentum shift in that game. And the 49ers, it seems, have never recovered since that game. If you recall, that game went to overtime. The 49ers only scored 22 points. And to me, I don't think it's a coincidence. They only scored 22. Their average was 22 points this entire year, which tells me that they haven't fully recovered from that game. And there's a lot of finger pointing. Their thought was if we can just get into the playoffs, we'll get back to the Super Bowl and then we'll go ahead and turn on the switch. That's not how it works. There's a lot of things that need to be addressed here. The defense, I think, needs to be addressed. You need to figure out, are we getting rid of Sorensen or not? If he To me, it seems like a lot of heads around the league feel that Sorensen runs a very vanilla defense. That means there's no exotic stunts, no exotic blitzes. It is very easy to figure out. But there was, even with the base defense, the defense wasn't communicating effectively, and that comes down from the coach. And so this is his first year in that role, and so I think you need to evaluate, can he get better in this role, or do we need to make a change? Uh, let's be honest. If Kyle and John Lynch miss the playoffs again next year, and you have another year just like this, they will be on the hot seat. Jed York gave them a vote of confidence this year, saying that they'll be back this next year. But you can bet your top dollar that if they miss the playoffs again and they have a season similar to this one, they will both be on the hot seat, if not out. Here in San Francisco. So you need to figure out, can Nick Sorensen turn the defense around? And if not, you need to either bring in a familiar face like a Robert Saleh, or see, is there anybody out there that you could probably pry off? We already know that the 49ers' top choice wasn't Sorensen. In fact, they went knocking over on the Chiefs store just to go see if there was any availability there. And so we know that the 49ers want to make adjustments. But the question is, if you make a change now, that will be 3 defensive coordinators within 3 years. And you can break that down. That would be essentially 5 in the past 6, because then you would have lost. You lost Robert Saleh, you lost D'Amico Ryans, Nick Sorensen, and then you had Steve Wilkes. And then now if you go to somebody else, that's a lot of changes. And so you need to figure out, how do we get somebody here, keep them around, that either A, already knows what we want to do here, we know the philosophy, and where Kyle Shanahan can trust them, where he could just focus on the offense. I think there was a lot of Kyle Shanahan in the room. You had Brandon Staley that was brought in as well, and I don't think that helped anybody. And so I think some of those things you have to figure out on the defensive side is, well, Robert Saleh is even interested in coming back, and if so, lock him up. I think that he brought in the defense that was brought over from Seattle, installed that DNA, that culture onto the team. Very rah guy. He's got the players' respect, and then he was able to teach his protege. That's where D'Amico Ryans came from. He picked up that same defense, and now look how well he's doing with the Houston Texans. And I think Kyle Shanahan thought that same culture, that same kind of philosophy would transfer over from Ryans to Sorensen, and it hasn't. And so I think there needs to be a change, and hopefully they find something that is an upgrade and not a change just to make a change. Because when you do that, nobody succeeds there. So I think that's one of the things that they need to address. And then on the offensive side, again, you're getting older. Trent Williams is getting older. Granted, he is still a Hall of Fame left tackle. When he's in the game, he's still probably the top 2 or 3 left tackles, if not the top left tackle in the NFL. But he missed most of the season this year. Now, granted, he didn't work out in preseason because of the contract hiccup. You have Brandon Ayuk, who's coming off of an ACL injury. You have Christian McCaffrey coming back. Hopefully, he'll come back the same. Deebo Samuel, who's up there in years. Ricky Pearsall, who was shot, but who started showing glimpses. So there's a lot of moving pieces, but especially the offensive line, which is the Achilles heel for the offense. You have Jake Brendel, who ranked 40 out of all centers in the NFL. That's right, 40 when there's 32 teams. That means out of all eligible centers that had enough snaps, he's still ranked dead last. So there needs to be an upgrade at the center position. Right tackle, we know that there has to be an upgrade. Aaron Banks is hitting free agency, and so we don't know what kind of payout he's going to get. Do we need to make an adjustment there? Dominic Pooney is going to be entrenched at the right guard position. Chris Forrester already said there's no plans to move him to left guard. So he's entrenched at the right guard position. Does Ben Barch make an upgrade? I do believe the center from Atlanta will be a free agent. I think that would be a great pickup for the 49ers. And then you need to build through the draft. There's a lot of these little nuances that you need to put in. And we know Kyle Shanahan doesn't really enjoy starting rookies. Dominic Pooney was one of those exceptions, and he really excelled and earned the coach's trust. But usually it takes a couple years for the Kyle Shanahan and the regime to start entrusting rookies. So if that's the case, find some veterans that you can plug in to the offensive line, because anybody that you plug in on the offensive line is going to be better than what you have out there right now. So Hopefully they can figure that offensive line out, because 22 points a game isn't going to cut it. Again, last year you had 28.8 points per game that you averaged throughout the season, roughly 29, and you have a full touchdown less this year that you're averaging. Not just that, you're getting older. The league is figuring you out. More and more teams are running the Kyle Shanahan, Mike Shanahan offense. So if that's the case, that means in practice, more and more teams are practicing against that offense because their own offense is running that same scheme. So Kyle needs to figure out a way. How do we stay a step ahead of the rest of the league? How do we continue to reinvent ourselves, but also to where the league is trying to play catch up with what we're doing? Because the reality is people have caught up. That's why Deebo Samuel is averaging less than 2 yards a carry when in the backfield. That's why he hasn't been able to get open. That's why they realize, you know what, if we play the 49ers man-to-man, they're not going to be able to throw on us because the receivers can't separate. Jawan Jennings, as great as he is, he's not a fast wide receiver. He's very good at contested catches. That's why he's starting Jawan. He can get to a spot. He can make those contested catches, but he's not going to break away from anybody. Deebo Samuel isn't going to break away from anybody. Brandon Ayuk was kind of that kind of ran very pure and clean routes, has some speed, and he's the guy that you need to kind of separate from one-on-one coverage. Ricky Pearsall, hopefully he can run those clean and pure routes the same way that Brandon Ayuk can. That'll help with the offense, but there needs to be some evolving, some adjustments in order to kind of take that next step on the offense. And I think the biggest thing you need to figure out, as George Kittle kind of alluded to, is we need to figure out this contract stuff. We can no longer allow these contract negotiations to go throughout the entire offseason, basically taking up all the attention from the media, all of the locker room conversations, because that doesn't help anybody. Because that means if you're in a contract stalemate, that player isn't out there working out with the team. They're not putting in the work that they need to. They're not going to training camp, and they're not football ready. When football season approaches, they're not going to be in football shape. And so if Brock is your guy, you need to figure out how do we come to an agreement without breaking the bank to where we could still put studs around him, but to a place where it's not going to force us to miss time in developing the younger guys or having him continue to work on his craft. So I think that's some of the big things that they need to figure out. And I think there's hope for it. You have an entire offseason. Typically, you go deep into the playoffs. This is what John Lynch was alluding to. You have a few weeks, and then guess what? We got the combine that we're going on. We got the draft. Then you have OTAs. Then you have the rookie symposium. You have all of these things where it's like boom, 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 boom. There's not really a time to relax, get your bodies right. And then for coaches to kind of really evaluate, because you're back to the next season. So I think they'll be able to take this time to kind of really look at it. But it doesn't make any sense if you don't make any true adjustments. If they don't take advantage of this time and say, you know what, we do need to change this, we can't do it the same way, then it's going to be beneficial. But if they're going to try to go back to the way things were, that's not going to solve it, because the players are older, and that same offense isn't going to do it this year. You need to continue evolving. You need to bring in better guys. You need to have another successful draft, just like you had this past year, and invest in the trenches. This year, you gave up 14 rushing touchdowns, which was not great. If you recall, the first or second year of the Lynch regime, they gave up one rushing touchdown all year. And it seems like ever since the adjustment to the interior of the defensive line, where DeForest Buckner was shipped off to Indianapolis, that the 49ers D-line hasn't been the same, specifically in the center of those trenches. So there needs to be an adjustment there. And I think if the 49ers address both offensive, defensive lines and figure out how do we get back from averaging 22 points on offense to 28, because again, Kyle Shanahan is supposed to be the offensive whiz. I think if they can figure out how to bridge that gap, then they'll be back into the playoff conversation. So I think, like Kittle said, like John Lynch said, there's a lot that the team needs to look at. They really need to address a lot of those pre-snaps, the plays, game management, and I think they have the right people in place to do it. They have the right players in the locker room. I believe in Kyle Shanahan. I do think, though, he needs to address the defensive coordinator position, and I think John Lynch needs to help save Kyle from himself. And what does that mean? That might mean letting go of a few veterans on that team. That might mean letting Charvarius Ward go. That might mean letting Deebo Samuel go, letting them go to free agency. And that way, Kyle can continue to work with other players and honestly not allow his relationships to get in the way of calling a great game on offense. You need to let Kyle Juszczyk go. I think if you have him out of the game, that gives you a lot more flexibility to have Juwan Jennings on the field more, Pearsall and Ayuk on the field more. Because let's face it, when Juszczyk is on the field, granted he's been great for years, but he's really lost a couple steps over the past couple years. When he's on the field, Juwan typically goes off the field. And I think the more and more you have Juwan Jennings on the field with Brandon Ayuk and Ricky Pearsall, then the more you can do. If they keep Debo, okay, then guess what? You can keep Ayuk, Debo, and Juwan Jennings on the field with Christian McCaffrey at the same time. Very lethal. When you have that, Debo can go and split almost like that two running back set with him and McCaffrey in the backfield with Jennings and Ayuk and Pearsall as well. Then you have Kittle. That is a lethal offense, but you can't do that when you have a Juszczyk around. And again, who knows if Debo is going to be around? There's a lot of conversations that need to happen, but I think there are certain players that John Lynch needs to help save Kyle from himself and just say, you know what, we need to let these players go. They've contributed a lot, but it's time for them to find another place. Well, we'll see what the offseason holds. We got the last game tomorrow against the Cardinals with Josh Dobbs. We'll see what he does. I'm kind of hoping they bring him back. I feel like this is an audition for him, but he may not want to come back considering he was third string for majority of the season, even though he shouldn't have been. So this could be an audition for other teams saying, look, I can start, but even if I can't start, I should be the number 2 guy. But here's the hoping he does well, but not too well, because I do think the 49ers want to keep that 11th draft slot. And so that's all we have for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll catch you